What if the meals that kept families alive in the 1920s would land you in court today? Foods once sold on every corner are now banned, blacklisted, or buried by law. Here are the things people used to eat, but that are now illegal. Back in the early 20th century, the booming fascination with science collided with marketing hype in a way that made radioactive elements seem like miracle ingredients. That's where radium-laced foods and drinks entered the picture, sold as energy boosters, beauty enhancers, and even aphrodisiacs. One of the most infamous products was Radithor, a radium-infused water marketed with the slogan, "A cure for the living dead." Spoiler, it turned out to be more of a shortcut to that status. The appeal wasn't purely gimmick. At the time, radium had just been discovered, and its glow symbolized cutting-edge health and vitality. In an age without the FDA as we know it today, regulation was minimal, and faith in science in a bottle ran high. Wealthy elites and athletes alike were sipping this glowing concoction with total confidence. Radium was often added to water, toothpaste, chocolate, and even butter. No, this wasn't some fringe trend. Radium-enhanced products were sold in department stores and pharmacies, treated as high-end health aids. The tragic irony? Prolonged exposure led to radiation sickness, anemia, and horrific jaw decay, as seen in the now-famous case of industrialist Eben Byers, who died after drinking over 1,000 bottles of Radithor. Long before anti-smoking campaigns and warning labels, marketing departments had a different idea: get them while they're young. That's how cigarette-infused candy found its way into the hands and mouths of kids across America in the 1920s. These weren't just sweets shaped like cigarettes. Some early versions actually contained traces of tobacco or nicotine flavoring, all wrapped in packaging that mimicked the real deal. The concept wasn't satire, it was strategy. Candy companies and tobacco brands knew what they were doing, and no one was really stopping them. These candies were made from sugar, corn syrup, and powdered flavoring, often chalky in texture, with one end dyed red to resemble a lit tip. Children would mimic adults, puffing pretend smoke before biting into the stick. It wasn't just play, it was training. Some brands even advertised the experience as "just like Dad's." There wasn't a national outcry until the 1950s, when public health data began linking smoking to cancer. Over time, more pediatricians and policymakers raised alarms about these candies normalizing smoking habits. Before refrigeration was common and safety standards were strictly enforced, many American households poured their milk straight from the cow to the table. No pasteurization, no problem. Known today as raw milk, this unprocessed version was a staple in the 1920s, particularly in rural communities. It wasn't a trendy health choice back then, it was what was available, affordable, and often the only option. Families typically kept a cow on the property or bought fresh milk directly from local dairies. It was strained to remove visible debris, cooled if possible, and consumed quickly to prevent spoilage. In theory, it was wholesome and nutrient-rich. In practice, it could also be a bacterial time bomb. Tuberculosis, brucellosis, and typhoid were just a few of the diseases linked to raw milk during the early 20th century. The turning point came with the rise of urban populations, where large-scale distribution increased the risks of contamination. Pasteurization, heating milk to kill harmful pathogens, was introduced not for flavor, but for survival. By the mid-20th century, it became the standard in most states, with laws gradually restricting the sale of raw milk. In the 1920s, fine dining didn't always mean filet mignon or lobster tail. Sometimes it meant a bite-sized bird served whole. Among the more unusual delicacies of the era was fried canary, along with other small songbirds like larks and finches. These tiny creatures were plucked, seasoned, and often pan-fried or roasted with herbs, then served in one piece, bones, beak, and all. The dish wasn't born of extravagance alone. In parts of Europe and among immigrant communities in America, small birds had long been a source of inexpensive protein. Preparation varied slightly by region, but the general method was simple. The bird was quickly cleaned, often singed over flame to remove feathers, and flash-fried until crispy. Diners would consume the entire bird in a few bites. In some circles, The experience was considered both culinary and cultural, a nod to old world traditions. However, as bird populations began to decline and awareness of wildlife preservation grew, the tide turned. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, strengthened in later decades, made it illegal to hunt or sell most native songbirds. Conservation replaced cuisine as the priority, and what was once an edible novelty became a symbol of overindulgence at nature's expense. Elegant dinner parties in the early 20th century often featured a dish that would be unthinkable on modern menus: canned sea turtle. Prized for its rich, tender meat, sea turtle was considered a luxury item, not just in the United States but throughout Europe. Turtle soup, especially made from green sea turtles, was a favorite among the elite, and by the 1920s, commercial canning made it accessible to a broader audience. You didn't need to live near the coast or wrangle one yourself. You could simply order a tin through a catalog or find it in upscale grocers. The meat was typically simmered into a thick soup or stew, often with sherry, vegetables, and spices. Some recipes called for mock turtle alternatives, using calf's head, but the real thing was the gold standard. In fact, sea turtle was so valued that it became a diplomatic dish, served at presidential banquets and state dinners. The demand, however, outpaced the supply. By mid-century, overhunting and habitat loss drove several sea turtle species toward extinction. International protections eventually made harvesting or selling sea turtles and their meat illegal in most of the world. In the smoky cafes of Paris and the tucked-away speakeasies of New York, a vivid green spirit earned both fame and infamy: absinthe, the original form. Known as the Green Fairy, this potent liquor wasn't just a drink, it was a ritual. Traditionally prepared by slowly dripping ice-cold water over a sugar cube balanced on a slotted spoon, the absinthe would cloud into a pale, opalescent swirl. To fans of the 1920s, this was sophistication in a glass. The main ingredients, wormwood, anise, and fennel, weren't the issue. It was thujone, a chemical compound found in wormwood, that stirred the controversy. Accusations flew that absinthe caused hallucinations, madness, and moral decay. The drink became a scapegoat for everything from artistic eccentricity to violent crime. One Swiss man famously blamed it for murdering his entire family, which helped fuel a global ban. Absinthe had become deeply embedded in European and American culture, particularly among writers, painters, and bohemians. But by the 1910s and 20s, bans spread like wildfire. The U.S. followed suit in 1912, nearly a decade before Prohibition, citing health concerns and public pressure. Hidden beneath a linen napkin and centuries of controversy, one of the most secretive dishes in culinary history was quietly devoured: ortolan bunting. This tiny songbird, no bigger than a thumb, was considered a delicacy among French gourmets and even found its way to American fine dining circles in the early 20th century. It wasn't necessity that put ortolan on the table. It was indulgence, pure and simple. Traditionally, the bird was captured at night using nets, then fattened in darkness, often with millet and figs. It was drowned in Armagnac, roasted whole, and served intact, bones, beak, and all. Diners would cover their heads with a napkin while eating, supposedly to trap the aroma, though critics argued it was really to hide the act from God or perhaps from dinner companions with less adventurous appetites. By the late 20th century, the ortolan population had sharply declined due to overhunting and habitat loss. France eventually banned its commercial sale in 1999 under pressure from environmentalists and the European Union. Today, catching or consuming the bird can carry heavy penalties, although black market dinners have reportedly continued in secret. In high-end banquets and wedding halls of the early 20th century, few dishes signaled wealth and prestige quite like shark fin soup. Imported from China and served in upscale restaurants from San Francisco to New York, it was a luxury that symbolized success, not sustenance. At the time, Americans were embracing international cuisines, and shark fin quickly became a showpiece in fine dining circles, especially in cities with large Chinese communities. The preparation was meticulous. The fins were dried, cleaned, and soaked for hours before being simmered in a rich broth, often with chicken, ham, or mushrooms to boost the flavor. Because here's the kicker: shark fin itself is nearly tasteless. What it brought to the dish was texture, not taste, along with a tradition that dated back centuries in Chinese imperial kitchens. But as demand rose, the supply chain took a dark turn. The practice of shark finning, removing the fins and discarding the rest of the shark at sea, drew global outrage. Entire species faced population collapse, and the ecological consequences became impossible to ignore. In response, states like California, New York, and Hawaii enacted bans on shark fin sales, joining a growing list of countries with similar laws. Among frontier communities, trappers, and even clergy, there was once a meal so prized that it earned a place at both survival camps and religious feasts: beaver tail. Not to be confused with the fried pastry of the same name. The real deal was a fatty, leathery delicacy enjoyed especially during harsh winters. It was rich in calories, high in oil content, and, according to those who ate it, surprisingly flavorful once properly prepared. Beaver tail was typically roasted over an open fire or boiled until the tough skin softened and blistered away, revealing a gelatinous, almost pork-like meat beneath. The high fat content made it an essential source of energy in cold climates. French-Canadian Catholics even classified it as fish to permit its consumption during Lent, a loophole that speaks volumes about its culinary significance. But necessity gave way to regulation as overtrapping led to drastic declines in beaver populations. Once abundant across North America, the animal became the focus of early conservation efforts. Trapping seasons were shortened, hunting bans enforced, and certain regions outlawed beaver harvesting entirely. When meat was scarce and protein needed stretching, Americans didn't always turn to the farm. Sometimes they turned to the sea. In the early 20th century, whale meat appeared in butcher shops and on menus, especially during wartime rationing and economic hardship. Though more commonly associated with Nordic and Japanese cuisine, whale was considered a practical solution during shortages, praised for its abundance and high fat content. The meat, often compared to beef but with a distinctly fishy undertone, was typically boiled, stewed, or ground into patties. It was even served in school cafeterias during World War II. Whale burgers? Anyone? Though not a hit with every palate, it was affordable, filling, and, at the time, seen as a reasonable use of natural resources. But necessity collided with consequence. Industrial whaling operations grew, and so did the toll on global whale populations. By the mid-1900s, many species were facing near extinction. International pressure mounted, and by the 1980s, the International Whaling Commission implemented a moratorium on commercial whaling. In the U.S., the Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972 made it illegal to hunt, sell, or consume whale meat, with very limited exceptions for indigenous communities. At one time, if you strolled through a diner in the Midwest or passed by a county fair in Indiana, you might have found a regional favorite that's nearly disappeared from American plates: brain sandwiches. Typically made with calf or pig brains, this dish was born from necessity. Every part of the animal was used, and nothing was wasted. Brains, though delicate, were considered a delicacy by many working-class families, especially in areas shaped by German-American culinary traditions. The preparation was as straightforward as it was bold. Brains were soaked, sliced, dredged in flour or cornmeal, then pan-fried until crispy on the outside and tender within. Served between slices of white bread or on a hamburger bun, often with mustard or onions, the brain sandwich offered both protein and pride in thriftiness. For decades, it was a staple in certain regions, but in the 1990s, concern over bovine spongiform encephalopathy, better known as mad cow disease, changed the conversation. Though most U.S. cases involved older cattle, federal regulations tightened, and the use of brain tissue in human food was heavily restricted or banned. In rural America during the 1920s, protein didn't always come shrink-wrapped from a supermarket. It often came from the woods, freshly hunted and dressed at home. Wild game meats like squirrel, raccoon, possum, rabbit, and even bear were regular fare for families living off the land. There was no USDA inspection, no commercial processing, just whatever the rifle or trap delivered. It wasn't exotic, it was dinner. Preparation varied widely. Squirrel was commonly stewed, raccoon roasted low and slow to cut the gaminess, and rabbit often fried in lard or simmered in gravy. Recipes passed down through generations reflected regional tastes and the practical need to make the most of every bite. In many places, wild game wasn't just tradition. It was survival during lean times, especially through the Great Depression. When Scandinavian immigrants brought their culinary traditions to the American Midwest, they didn't leave their lie behind. One of the most divisive dishes to survive the journey was lutefisk, a gelatinous preparation of dried whitefish, typically cod, reconstituted in water, then soaked in a lye solution until the texture resembled something between fish and jelly. In the 1920s, it wasn't just a holiday tradition. It was a symbol of cultural identity and resourcefulness. The process was intense. After drying and curing, the fish was submerged in cold water, then bathed in lye. Yes, the same caustic chemical used in soap making. Once the lye rendered the flesh soft and translucent, it had to be soaked again, often for days, to remove any remaining toxicity. Done right, the final product was gently baked or steamed and served with butter, cream sauce, or, if you were lucky, a stiff drink to chase it down. The trouble came with consistency. Home cooks sometimes used industrial-grade lye, unaware of its dangers. With no regulation, food safety varied wildly. Eventually, concerns about caustic burns and chemical contamination led the FDA to restrict food-grade lye use and require careful handling in commercial settings. In farm kitchens across 1920s America, no part of the animal was wasted, not even the blood. That's how pig's blood soup, also known in some communities as dinuguan or black soup, found its way to the table. For immigrant families from Eastern Europe, Asia, and the American South, it wasn't just a cultural carryover, it was a matter of thrift and survival. When you raised and butchered your own hogs, making use of the blood wasn't unusual. It was expected. Typically prepared by simmering fresh pig's blood with vinegar, garlic, onions, and various seasonings, the soup thickened as it cooked and developed a rich, earthy flavor. Some recipes added offal or meat chunks for texture. Served over rice or bread, it was hearty, filling, and undeniably efficient. The key ingredient, however, had to be handled with precision. Blood spoils fast, and mishandling could lead to serious health risks. By the mid-20th century, food safety regulations began tightening. The USDA and state health departments introduced rules requiring blood to be collected, stored, and processed under strict conditions, requirements that many home kitchens simply couldn't meet. As a result, selling or serving pig's blood dishes became illegal in certain states, particularly where raw blood couldn't be guaranteed safe. On Burns Night or at a Scottish family gathering, it wasn't unusual to see guests passing around a steaming oatmeal-stuffed sheep's stomach, proudly known as haggis. This traditional dish, born of necessity and full respect for the animal, was celebrated by immigrants in early 20th century America, especially in communities determined to keep their culinary roots alive. In the 1920s, authentic haggis was both accessible and uncontroversial, often made right at home. The classic preparation called for finely minced sheep liver, heart, and lungs mixed with oats, sweet, onions, and spices. The mixture was stuffed into a sheep's stomach and boiled for hours. The result was a dense, savory pudding served with potatoes and turnips, a dish praised more for heritage than presentation. In Scotland, it's a national treasure. In the US, it became a legal target. The issue? The lungs. Under USDA regulations introduced in 1971, sheep lungs are banned for human consumption in the United States due to concerns over potential contamination during slaughter. In the early 20th century, before the FDA had teeth and when labels made promises without proof, Americans sipped on something they believed could cure fatigue, liven the complexion, and boost vitality: arsenic-containing tonic waters. Though it sounds like the setup to a murder mystery, these tonics were widely sold and consumed by both men and women as part of daily health routines. At the time, arsenic was considered a therapeutic agent in small doses and was even prescribed by physicians to treat everything from anemia to syphilis. The most popular of these concoctions were sold under names like Fowler's solution or Donovan's solution, often mixed into water or other beverages. Some over-the-counter tonic waters marketed to the public even contained trace amounts of arsenic compounds, advertised as skin enhancers or appetite stimulants. A little poison, they claimed, was just what the body needed to feel more alive. The problem wasn't immediate toxicity, it was long-term exposure. Chronic arsenic ingestion led to symptoms ranging from skin lesions and organ damage to cancer. By the 1940s, the medical community began to understand the cumulative dangers, and public health agencies moved to ban its use in food and drink. At a time when tonic could mean anything from herbal relief to high-voltage pick-me-up, one particular elixir promised to energize the weary and stimulate the nerves: strychnine tonic. Yes, strychnine, the same substance better known as rat poison, was once a common ingredient in over-the-counter remedies and even prescriptions. In the early 20th century, tiny doses were believed to act as a stimulant for the nervous system, especially in treatments for fatigue, digestive issues, and even erectile dysfunction. Often marketed under names like nerve tonics or digestive bitters, these formulas were diluted enough to avoid immediate poisoning, assuming the dosage was followed precisely. Bottles often contained alcohol as a base, along with herbs, spices, and strychnine nitrate or sulfate in homeopathic quantities. The kick wasn't imagined, it was chemical. As medicine evolved and pharmacology became more precise, the risks of strychnine began to outweigh its perceived benefits. Even in minuscule doses, repeated exposure could trigger muscle spasms, anxiety, and in severe cases, respiratory failure. Accidental overdoses weren't uncommon, especially with vague labeling and inconsistent formulas. Before colas and lemon lime took over American soda fountains, the reigning flavor of old-fashioned refreshment was rooted, literally, in the forest floor. Drinks flavored with sassafras oil, especially old-school root beer, were beloved across the country in the 1920s. Extracted from the bark or root of the sassafras tree, this oil gave beverages their spicy, sweet kick, instantly recognizable and uniquely nostalgic to anyone who grew up with it. Sassafras wasn't just flavor, it was folklore. Touted in tonics and homemade concoctions, it was believed to purify the blood, cure colds, and promote general well-being. Homebrewers and soda companies alike used the oil to produce batches of root beer and tea, and it was often enjoyed chilled on porches or poured over ice cream for floats. But in the 1960s, researchers found that safrole, the main compound in sassafras oil, was carcinogenic in high doses, linked to liver cancer in lab animals. That discovery changed everything. The FDA swiftly banned the use of safrole in commercially produced foods and drinks. While artificial sassafras flavors remain legal today, the real oil is strictly controlled. Long before artificial flavoring revolutionized the dessert world, luxury kitchens leaned on rare and exotic ingredients, none more curious than ambergris, a substance famously described as whale vomit, though technically it's expelled from the other end. Produced in the digestive tracts of sperm whales, ambergris was valued not for its origin story, but for its deep, musky aroma and subtle, earthy flavor. In the 1920s, it was a sought-after addition in perfumery and, more surprisingly, in food, especially high-end desserts. Used sparingly, ambergris was grated or steeped to infuse puddings, custards, and jellies. A dash could transform a dish into something elite, with European aristocrats and American chefs using it to add mystery and luxury to the final course. The high cost wasn't just for show, it was supply and demand. Ambergris was, and still is, extremely rare, often found floating in the ocean or washed up on shorelines. Over time, ethical and environmental concerns caught up with the practice. As whales became protected under international law, so too did the trade and use of anything derived from them. In American kitchens of the 1920s, few ingredients were as versatile or as sacred as rendered pork fat. Lard-fried everything wasn't just a cooking method, it was a way of life. From crispy chicken to flaky pie crusts, lard was the default fat on hand, prized for its high smoke point and rich flavor. It came from backyard butchering, sat in a tin by the stove, and found its way into nearly every meal of the day. This wasn't indulgence, it was efficiency. Lard was inexpensive, shelf-stable, and readily available from home-raised hogs. Frying in it gave food a golden crunch unmatched by modern oils. Cooks didn't think twice about deep-frying donuts, potatoes, or even bread in lard. It was Grandma's secret weapon and the reason your biscuits tasted better than anything at the store. But by the mid-20th century, health science began catching up. Lard was high in saturated fat, and by the 1970s, the rise of vegetable shortening and concerns about heart disease pushed it out of mainstream kitchens. The final blow came when many commercial lard products were hydrogenated, introducing trans fats. Those in turn became heavily regulated or banned. In the backwoods, basements, and barns of 1920s America, the sound of bubbling copper stills was almost as common as church bells on Sunday. Homemade moonshine, illicit, unaged whiskey, wasn't just a rebellious pastime during Prohibition. It was often used for food preservation, flavoring, or trading when money was tight. With store-bought liquor banned and economic uncertainty looming, rural communities leaned into centuries-old distilling techniques to make spirits that ranged from barely drinkable to downright dangerous. Using cornmeal, sugar, water, and yeast, moonshiners crafted high-proof alcohol through fermentation and distillation, often with improvised equipment. Beyond its use as a stiff drink, moonshine found its way into cooking, infusing pies, cakes, sauces, and even cough remedies. It was flavor, fuel, and sometimes currency. But the same batch that could warm your chest might also burn your esophagus. Lacking regulation, homemade moonshine was notorious for contamination, sometimes containing methanol or lead from faulty stills. Health risks, along with its untaxed status, led federal and state governments to crack down hard. Centuries before protein bars lined supermarket shelves, indigenous peoples across North America had already perfected a high-energy, long-lasting survival food, pemmican. By the 1920s, settlers, trappers, and homesteaders had adopted the tradition, particularly in frontier regions where refrigeration was non-existent and calories were hard-earned. Made with rendered fat, dried meat, often wild game like bison, elk, or deer, and sometimes berries, pemmican was portable, shelf-stable, and astonishingly dense in nutrition. The process began with drying meat over smoke or sun, then pounding it into a fine powder. Melted fat was mixed in, binding the ingredients into a paste or pressed into cakes. When done correctly, pemmican could last for months or even years without spoiling. Hunters packed it for long trips, and families relied on it during harsh winters when fresh meat wasn't available. A single handful could keep you going all day. Think of it as the original energy bar with a wild twist. But modern health codes don't see it quite that way. Because it's made with wild, uninspected meat, traditional pemmican is illegal to sell in most states. The USDA restricts the sale of meat products not processed in certified facilities, even if the preparation method is time-tested. When dairy was scarce or too expensive, Americans turned to alternatives, some of which, in hindsight, should have come with a warning label. In the 1920s, butter substitutes with harmful additives were widely used across homes and institutions. Margarine, the most common replacement, wasn't the smooth, heart-conscious spread we know today. Early formulations often included questionable ingredients such as whale oil, cottonseed oil, or artificial dyes, some of which contained toxic compounds like lead or aniline derivatives to mimic butter's golden hue. Necessity made it popular. Butter was rationed during wartime, and in urban areas, refrigeration was unreliable. Margarine was cheap, shelf-stable, and easy to produce in bulk. It was even promoted in cookbooks and public school menus as a modern miracle food. The catch? Some versions were chemically unstable or contained substances that would never pass modern food safety standards. As public health research advanced, so did the scrutiny. By the mid-20th century, mounting concerns about trans fats, toxic additives, and long-term health effects led to stricter regulation. The FDA banned harmful coloring agents and required standardized labeling. Old staple for decades, canned tuna was a go-to choice for quick meals and affordable protein. Packed with convenience and a mild flavor that fit everything from sandwiches to casseroles, its popularity surged throughout the 20th century. But hidden beneath its silver lid was an ingredient no one had bargained for: mercury. Some brands of tuna contained alarmingly high levels of the toxic metal, a risk that went largely unnoticed in the 1960s when food safety regulations had yet to catch up with modern science. Back then, concerns over contaminants weren't front-page news. The average consumer had little reason to suspect that a simple tuna salad might come with a side of neurological damage. Mercury, a heavy metal that can accumulate in the body, posed serious health risks, especially for pregnant women and young children. Symptoms of mercury poisoning included cognitive impairments, muscle weakness, and developmental issues, hardly what anyone expected from a lunchtime staple. As research progressed, regulatory agencies stepped in. By the 1970s, the FDA began imposing stricter limits on mercury levels in seafood, and today, guidelines recommend limiting the consumption of certain fish. In the 1970s, the diet food industry was booming. With calorie counting in full swing, people were looking for ways to satisfy their sweet tooth without the guilt. Saccharin became the answer. Found in everything from diet sodas to sugar-free desserts, it was a game changer. Hundreds of times sweeter than sugar, yet with none of the calories. It didn't taste exactly like sugar, but for those determined to stay slim, it was close enough. Saccharin had actually been around since the late 1800s, but it wasn't until the mid-20th century that it took over the diet market. People stirred it into their coffee, poured it over cereal, and downed it in soft drinks like Tab. It was everywhere, until scientists started raising concerns. In the early 1970s, studies linked saccharin to bladder cancer in lab rats, setting off alarm bells. The FDA responded by mandating warning labels on products containing the sweetener, effectively scaring off a lot of consumers. Despite the controversy, saccharin never fully disappeared. Later research suggested the rat studies didn't translate directly to humans, and by 2000, the cancer warning was removed. Today, it's still around, though it competes with newer artificial sweeteners. Back then, though, it was the diet craze's best friend. Until it wasn't. Funnily enough, beluga caviar used to be pretty cheap. I mean, by the 50s, it was definitely a plaything of the uber elite, but it started out as a pretty cheap thing you could just get from sturgeon. It's kind of hard to imagine, right? The image we associate with it today started from upper-class culture, basically putting the thing on a pedestal. It didn't help that every establishment that was meant to cater to this exclusive class was also putting it on all of their menus. You had beluga caviar on crackers with expensive champagne or chilled vodka, with blini and creme fraiche. The possibilities were pretty endless. It became something you associate with old money, with diplomatic gatherings and big political events, and the kind of thing that was just too rich for the blood of an average worker. That's still true today, but hey, it's at least comforting to know that in some era, it used to be considered pretty cheap, almost unsavory, really. Do you get the hype? I mean, let's say you had the money to burn. Would you still be spending it on caviar? Not to impress a date or to hit a rich flex, just as a food. So, you're all familiar with the way Coca-Cola used to have cocaine, right? Well, in the 1950s, that stopped being a thing, at least on paper. While city rats today might prompt a frantic call to pest control, desperate times during the Great Depression transformed these rodents from street menace to last resort protein. Eating rat meat wasn't common practice, but urban families facing starvation did indeed resort to capturing and cooking these widely detested animals. Origins. Historical accounts indicate that rat dinners emerged mostly from extreme necessity rather than culinary experimentation, with some cooks humorously admitting the biggest challenge was convincing diners it tasted almost like rabbit, provided they didn't think too hard about it. Naturally, health concerns arose from consuming urban rodents, notorious carriers of disease. Think plague and leptospirosis, conditions more serious than indigestion after Thanksgiving dinner. These legitimate dangers pushed health authorities to unequivocally declare rat meat illegal and unsafe, permanently closing down any possibility of a rat roast revival. Modern laws reflect clear public health priorities, strictly forbidding consumption of rodents, classifying them as dangerous vermin rather than. By the 1980s, salmon wasn't just a high-end delicacy. It was quickly becoming an everyday dinner option. Thanks to the rise of farmed salmon, grocery stores could offer it at lower prices, and restaurants could serve it year-round. But beneath the pink fillets and fancy plating, the industry was facing serious problems. In the early days, salmon farming was like the Wild West. Little regulation, few environmental controls, and plenty of health concerns. The biggest issue was overcrowding. Early salmon farms packed fish into small enclosures, creating the perfect breeding ground for parasites and disease. To keep infections under control, farmers turned to antibiotics and chemical treatments, some of which later raised concerns about contamination. Meanwhile, waste from the farms polluted surrounding waters, leading to long-term damage in coastal ecosystems. Consumers weren't aware of these problems. All they knew was that salmon had become more affordable and widely available. It wasn't until researchers started linking farmed salmon to higher levels of PCBs and other contaminants that public concern grew. By the 1990s and 2000s, governments stepped in, tightening regulations on antibiotics, feed quality, and farming conditions. In the mid-20th century, the agricultural industry was on a mission to maximize production, and antibiotics played a key role in that effort. One in particular, chloramphenicol, became a popular choice for keeping livestock healthy and increasing meat yields. Farmers saw it as an efficient way to prevent infections in crowded conditions, while food producers benefited from higher output. For a time, it seemed like a win-win, until scientists uncovered the serious health risks lurking beneath the surface. Unlike some antibiotics that merely disrupt digestion, chloramphenicol posed a far more alarming danger: aplastic anemia, a rare but potentially fatal condition where the body stops producing enough blood cells. The problem wasn't just with direct exposure. Traces of the antibiotic could linger in meat and dairy products, making their way onto dinner tables across the country. Consumers had no way of knowing that their Sunday roast might come with a side of medical complications. As evidence mounted, regulators took action. By the 1980s, chloramphenicol was banned in food production in many countries, including the United States. Today, strict testing ensures that no remnants make it into the food supply. For much of American history, wild game meat wasn't just for hunters, it was for sale. In rural areas, local butchers and roadside markets offered everything from venison to wild rabbit, often sourced straight from the woods. No USDA inspections, no government oversight, just the trust that if a guy in town sold it, it was good. And for many, it was. Fresh, lean, and often cheaper than store-bought beef, roasts, rabbit stews, fried squirrel, whatever was available, people knew how to cook it. Some families had a deep knowledge of butchering and preserving, passed down for generations. But the problem wasn't always in how it was cooked, it was what might be lurking in the meat before it ever hit the pan. With no inspections, there was no way to guarantee wild game was free from disease, parasites, or contamination. By the late 20th century, regulations cracked down, requiring all commercially sold meat to go through USDA inspection. While personal hunting remains legal, selling wild game without certification is now largely banned. Red dye number 2, or otherwise known as amaranth, was actually one of the most popular artificial food colorings ever produced. If you ever had candy, soda, processed meat, hell, if you bought certain kinds of makeup, there were high chances this was either on your skin or in your system. Now, normally, people didn't care too much about it. I mean, it's the 50s, that's kind of on brand for the time period, right? And why would they? It was resistant to heat, it could be used in liquid form and powder, It was a lot cheaper, easy to produce in bulk, it could be used with everything, and the color was just spectacular. So some of you might immediately express a lot of enthusiasm after hearing that. But some of you might think, what's the catch? Raise a suspicious eyebrow, or just think that this is too good to be true. And you'd be exactly right. The Food and Drugs Administration outlawed amaranth in around 1976 because studies had suggested that it actually increased the chances of cancer. Scientists had begun to link potential carcinogenic effects, and amaranth in particular came under scrutiny. There were all sorts of rumors about it. From your head to your toes, it could give you tumors anywhere like mosquitoes give you rashes. This pretty much sealed the deal for the industry, and as they wanted to get ahead of the issue, the ban became a pretty clear solution. Meat was crucial when refrigeration wasn't an option, so Depression-era families turned to unpasteurized home-canned meats, a kitchen practice that involved cooking meat cuts, placing them in reused glass jars, then sealing tightly with wax or rudimentary lids. Housewives proudly displayed pantry shelves stocked with jars filled with pork, beef, or chicken simmered simply in their own juices, offering a reliable meal source during the harshest months. Although economical, this preservation method was essentially playing culinary roulette. Without pressure cookers, botulism thrived unseen, sometimes delivering more than families bargained for at dinner. After all, homemade pickles were tasty, paralysis not so much. In fact, botulism outbreaks from improperly canned meats contributed significantly to the establishment of strict federal regulations mandating pressure canning and pasteurization to safeguard consumers. By mid-century, labels, expiration dates, and government oversight replaced wax seals and guesswork, legally forbidding unpasteurized home-canned meats from commercial sale and strongly discouraging them domestically. Soft, fluffy, and perfectly risen, bread in the 1980s was everything consumers wanted it to be. Whether it was sandwich loaves or dinner rolls, commercial bakeries had a secret ingredient to get that ideal texture: potassium bromate. Added to dough as an oxidizing agent, it strengthened gluten and gave bread a light, airy structure. But what seemed like a harmless baking trick turned into a serious health concern. By the late 20th century, researchers discovered that potassium bromate was linked to cancer in lab animals, particularly affecting the kidneys and thyroid. The problem was that, if not fully baked out, traces of the chemical could remain in the final product. While food manufacturers argued that proper baking eliminated any risks, health regulators weren't convinced. Countries like the UK, Canada, and the entire European Union banned potassium bromate outright, while Japan placed strict restrictions on its use. In the US, the FDA stopped encouraging its use but never fully banned it, leaving it up to states and manufacturers to phase it out. Some companies did, switching to safer alternatives, but others continued using it quietly. Seafood has long been praised as a healthy, protein-rich option, but in the 1960s, some portions came with an unexpected side effect: mercury exposure. As industrial pollution increased, heavy metals made their way into oceans and rivers, accumulating in fish that millions consumed daily. At the time, awareness of mercury's dangers was limited, and food regulations had yet to impose strict monitoring. Consumers enjoyed their seafood dinners unaware that certain species carried levels of the toxic element high enough to pose serious health risks. Mercury is particularly insidious because it builds up in the body over time. While a single meal wouldn't cause immediate harm, consistent exposure could lead to neurological damage, developmental issues in children, and even kidney failure. Pregnant women were at the highest risk, as mercury could interfere with fetal brain development. Yet, in the mid-century push for convenience and affordability, few questioned what lurked beneath the surface of their favorite fish dishes. It wasn't until the 1970s, after growing scientific research and public outcry, that regulatory agencies like the FDA established strict mercury limits in seafood. In the 1970s, lighting up a cigarette at the dinner table wasn't just allowed, it was expected. Restaurants had ashtrays on every table, waiters took orders through a haze of smoke, and no one batted an eye if you alternated bites of steak with puffs of a Marlboro. Whether at home, in a diner, or even on an airplane, Smoking while eating was just part of the culture. Back then, cigarette ads featured doctors, Hollywood icons, and even cartoon camels, reinforcing the idea that smoking wasn't just normal, it was sophisticated. Families would gather around the table, and after a home-cooked meal, someone would light up without a second thought. At fast food joints, parents puffed away while kids unwrapped cheeseburgers. Even in fancy restaurants, a good meal was often finished with a cigarette and a cup of coffee, like some kind of ritual. But as medical studies piled up linking secondhand smoke to serious health risks, the public's tolerance started to shift. The first major bans started in the late 80s, and by the 2000s, smoking in restaurants was virtually extinct. Before I start telling you about the tragic downfall of absinthe, let's do a little summary on what it really is. So, it's this green spirit that you get from mixing a few herbs, but the one we really need to keep track of here is wormwood. Why? Well, besides the fact that it gets its name from wormwood, Artemisia absinthium, the thing itself has a spicy little compound we call thujone, or otherwise known as the 50s equivalent of acid. Except we're not talking about a nice little trip with your friends and your sunset lamp psychedelic playlist. This time, we're talking about cases of epilepsy, insanity, and aggression in users. This eventually evolved into hysteria after the absinthe murder of 1905. One Jean Lanfray ended up killing his entire family after a long night with absinthe and several other drinks. And by 1912, hysteria had gotten so bad that the United States had outlawed it completely. In the 50s, you still couldn't get it legally, especially not for personal use. You would have to get it smuggled in from Spain or Portugal, and most people would just make bootleg absinthe, which was even worse. I mean worse as in it'll do whatever alcohol does to you regularly. Scientists ended up finding out that thujone actually doesn't cause insanity or anything of the sort, and Jean was just yet another drunken homicidal maniac. And empty stomachs growled louder than consciences. Desperate Depression-era families sometimes turned to stealing eggs from wild bird nests, transforming survival into a risky game of climbing trees and dodging angry mother birds. Children often undertook this daring pantry raid, carefully selecting nests perched high above the ground, collecting delicate eggs from robins, sparrows, or doves. These tiny eggs were either scrambled or fried, occasionally mixed into baked goods or cooked into miniature omelets, providing valuable protein at virtually no cost, except perhaps the occasional scratch or angry peck. Cookbooks didn't endorse nest raiding outright, but folklore and family recipes quietly suggested the eggs tasted richer and creamier than typical store-bought versions, perhaps flavored by adrenaline from evading dive-bombing parents. However, what began as a necessary measure evolved into a serious ecological threat as declining bird populations led to stringent protections. Under today's strict wildlife conservation laws, specifically the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, stealing wild eggs is explicitly illegal, punishable by substantial fines or even imprisonment. Few foods capture the nostalgia of childhood quite like a bowl of wobbly, neon-colored gelatin. Whether layered in a church potluck dish or molded into some questionable 80s creation, Jell-O was an undeniable staple of American households. It was cheap, easy to make, and came in colors that didn't exist in nature, literally. The vibrant hues that made Jell-O so iconic came from artificial food dyes, some of which were later linked to health risks. Red No. 3, for example, was widely used in gelatin products before studies connected it to thyroid tumors in lab animals. Yellow No. 5 and Blue No. 1, both common in Jell-O, were also scrutinized for potential behavioral effects in children. While food manufacturers insisted these dyes were safe in small amounts, consumer advocacy groups weren't convinced. By the 1990s and 2000s, some countries, including parts of Europe, began banning or restricting certain artificial colors. In the US, the FDA placed stricter regulations on labeling, and some brands voluntarily reformulated their products. Despite concerns, Jell-O remained a household favorite, proving that nothing, not even a little controversy, could shake its place in American kitchens. Of all the risky delicacies in food history, few come with stakes as high as canned puffer fish. Revered for its delicate taste, Yet feared for its lethal potential, this fish contains tetrodotoxin, a neurotoxin so potent that a dose smaller than a pinhead can cause paralysis and death. Today, only highly trained chefs are allowed to prepare it, but in the past, access was far less controlled. In unregulated markets, improperly prepared fugu was available in cans, turning a simple meal into a gamble with survival. The appeal of fugu wasn't just about flavor, it was about thrill. For some, eating it was a status symbol, a culinary daredevil act that proved one's bravery. But unlike most food-related risks, this one didn't end with an upset stomach. There's no antidote for tetrodotoxin, meaning a mistake in preparation could be fatal. Yet, regulations in the 1960s weren't nearly as strict as they are today, and canned versions were sold in some markets without the careful oversight now required. As reports of poisoning surfaced, authorities clamped down. Many countries banned unregulated sales, limiting its preparation to certified chefs. Grocery shopping in the 1970s came with a little more mystery than most people realized, especially at the butcher counter. While shoppers expected to get ground beef, hot dogs, or sausage, what they didn't always know was that those meats often contained organ meats like heart, liver, or tongue, blended right in without any clear labeling. It wasn't considered deceptive, it was just how things were done. Waste not, want not. Organ meats had been a staple in traditional cooking for centuries. They were nutrient-dense, packed with iron and vitamins, and most importantly, cheap. For meat processors, using every part of the animal made economic sense. Instead of tossing organ cuts aside, they were mixed into processed meats to add volume and keep costs down. Some people had no issue with it. After all, dishes like liver and onions were common. But others had no idea what they were eating. By the late 20th century, food regulations tightened, and full disclosure became mandatory. Labels had to clearly state what was inside, and consumers got a better understanding of what was actually in their meat. Lead-soldered canned foods were actually a lot more common than you would think. I mean, leading just is a bad idea, but I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they didn't know what they were doing back then. It was a pretty unrecognized public health risk. Canning technology was definitely picking up speed, but the deep, nitty-gritty effects of all this modernization were still subjects that were being studied. Lead-based soldering was unfortunately too common before all of this advancement, and it was extremely common throughout military rationing. Now, modern industries use welded seam canning, but most cans had been sealed with lead because it was really easy to work with. Making sure that the can was as airtight as it could be, it was very resistant to corrosion, and it had a very long shelf life. The issue happens when, well, literally anything unexpected occurs. Say you're just chatting away with your wife while you unpack the groceries and get them ready for the shelf, and you just happen to drop a can. Happens to the best of us, right? Well, let's say the interior was damaged because the big bad fall actually hurt the can. Now you have your food in contact with lead. Let's say it wasn't your fault at all, it was just soldered improperly. For decades, canned fruit was a kitchen staple. Canned peaches in particular were a favorite, whether spooned over ice cream, baked into cobblers, or eaten straight from the can. But in the 1980s, these sugary, syrupy treats were sometimes packed with more than just fruit. They also contained traces of lead, thanks to the cans they were stored in. Before modern packaging regulations, many food cans were sealed with lead-based solder, a practice that had been around for decades. While this worked well for durability, it created a serious health risk. Over time, acidic foods like peaches and other canned fruits could cause the lead to leach into the contents, exposing consumers to potential lead poisoning. Even in small amounts, lead can cause neurological damage, developmental issues in children, and long-term organ damage. The problem wasn't new, but it took years for regulations to catch up. By the late 1980s, the FDA and other health agencies started cracking down on lead-soldered cans, urging manufacturers to switch to safer materials. By 1991, the U.S. officially banned lead in food cans, forcing companies to adopt modern, lead-free alternatives. In the 1960s, packaging was more about durability and design than long-term safety, and nowhere was that more evident than in lead-based paint on food containers. Vibrant labels, eye-catching colors, and a sturdy finish made these containers look appealing on store shelves. But hidden beneath the surface was a toxic hazard. Lead-based paint, commonly used in everything from household walls to children's toys, also found its way onto food packaging, a decision that, in hindsight, was as dangerous as it sounds. At the time, lead's risks weren't fully understood by the general public. While scientists had long suspected its dangers, regulations were slow to catch up. The problem was that lead doesn't just stay on the surface. Over time, it can leach into food, especially acidic products like canned tomatoes. Consumers had no way of knowing that their favorite pantry staples might come with a side of neurotoxicity. The health risks were severe. Chronic exposure to lead can cause developmental issues in children, memory problems in adults, and even organ failure in extreme cases. As research mounted, the government stepped in. By the late 1970s, lead-based paints were banned from food-related products. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to let us know which one of these meals shocked you the most.